For 57 years, the Patterson-Gimlin film survived every attempt to kill it. Skeptics tried to kill it. Scientists tried to kill it. Biomechanics experts, primatologists, costume designers, even a public hoax confession from a man who claimed he wore the suit himself, none of it managed to settle the question once and for all. The footage just kept surviving, grainy and unresolved, sitting in the middle of American culture like a splinter nobody could quite pull out. Then, in 2022, a film instructor in Washington state opened her dead father's locked safe and found a reel of 16mm film that, by every reasonable account, should not have existed. What was on that reel would eventually reach the son of the man who shot the original footage. It would pull loose a secret that three families had been quietly sitting on for more than half a century. And by the time it finally reached the public in the spring of 2026, it would blow apart nearly 6 decades of argument, while somehow still leaving the most basic human questions completely unresolved. This is the story of the Patterson-Gimlin film, the documentary that claims to have finally cracked it, and the uncomfortable truth about what evidence can and cannot prove, even when it is sitting right in front of you on a strip of aging celluloid. To understand what happened in 2026, you first have to understand what happened on October 20th, 1967, along a dry creek bed called Bluff Creek in Humboldt County, Northern California. 2 men were there: Roger Patterson, a 34-year-old former rodeo rider from Yakima, Washington, and Robert Gimlin, a rancher and horseman who had joined him on the expedition. Patterson was not a scientist and had no formal training as a filmmaker. What he had was an obsession. He had already self-published a book about the creature before he ever rented a camera, and he had spent years chasing sightings and footprint reports across the Pacific Northwest. For this particular trip, he rented a Kodak K100 16mm camera, and by multiple accounts, he was already overdue returning it, to the point that an arrest warrant had reportedly been filed back home in Yakima over the unpaid rental. That detail matters, because it establishes something important about the man at the center of this story before a single frame of the footage is even discussed. Roger Patterson was, by the accounts of people who knew him, restless, charismatic, persuasive, and not always entirely straightforward about the details of his own life. He was also, according to the same people, a man capable of talking almost anyone into almost anything. Patterson and Gimlin were not scientists on a research expedition. They were 2 men from a working-class corner of eastern Washington who had spent months, by some accounts years, deliberately chasing rumors of large, unexplained footprints reported in that specific stretch of Northern California forest. That detail is often lost in later retellings, but it matters. They did not stumble onto Bluff Creek by accident. They went there because earlier expeditions in the area had already turned up tracks nobody could explain, which means whatever happened next happened in a location that had already been selected for its mythology. What Patterson and Gimlin claim happened next has become one of the most repeated stories in American folklore. Riding along the creek bed, they say they came upon a large, hair-covered, upright figure crouched near the water. Patterson's horse reportedly reared and threw him to the ground. He scrambled back up, grabbed his rented camera, and ran toward the creature while filming, producing 59.5 seconds of handheld 16mm footage across 954 frames. The figure, which researchers would later nickname Patty, walks upright across the sandbar with broad shoulders, long arms that hang lower than a human's proportionally would, and a distinctive rolling gait. At one specific moment, now famously identified as frame 352, the figure turns its head and glances directly back at the camera. That single glance, lasting a fraction of a second in real time, became the image that launched decades of obsessive analysis. The film was developed, and within weeks Patterson was touring it around the country, appearing on television talk shows and selling distribution rights to multiple parties, a decision that would later drag him into years of costly legal disputes. From the moment it was released, the film split into 2 camps, and both camps built genuinely serious cases. On the side of authenticity, the most detailed technical argument came from Bill Munns, a Hollywood makeup and visual effects specialist who approached the footage not as a believer, but as a craftsman trying to solve a practical problem. Frame by frame, Munns documented what he described as visible muscle movement throughout the sequence, contracting quadriceps with each step, shifting shoulder blades as the arms swing, and breast tissue that moves independently in a way consistent with loose biological tissue rather than a rigid costume structure. His professional conclusion, reached after years of study, was that replicating this level of anatomical detail with the costume technology available in 1967 would have required capabilities that simply did not exist in the film industry at that time. Alongside Munns, the biomechanical case was carried for decades by Jeff Meldrum, a professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University, who died in late 2025 still defending the film's authenticity. Meldrum focused on what researchers call a compliant gait, meaning the figure walks with consistently bent knees rather than the locked knee, inverted pendulum mechanics that humans naturally default to, even when trying to fake an unusual walk. He combined that with foot pressure distribution data pulled from plaster casts made at the site, some measuring roughly 14.5 inches long with a stride exceeding 4 feet, arguing that the depth and biomechanical signature of those prints pointed to a mass and foot anatomy fundamentally unlike anything human. The film itself has an odd physical footprint that rarely gets discussed outside of dedicated research circles. What most people picture when they think of the Patterson-Gimlin film is really a short segment of a much longer reel. The total footage runs to roughly 23 feet and 85 hundredths of an inch of actual creature footage, but it is preceded by more than 76 feet of earlier material, showing the two men on horseback before the sighting occurred. It was shot at 16 frames per second, a speed choice that would later matter enormously to biomechanics researchers trying to calculate the true walking speed and stride length of whatever is moving across that sandbar. Even the date has been quietly disputed for decades, with some researchers arguing the footage may have actually been shot slightly earlier than the October 20th date the two men always gave publicly, a small discrepancy that skeptics have pointed to as one more example of inconsistency surrounding the men's own account of what happened. On the skeptical side, the case rested on two pillars that never really moved in 57 years. The first was simply the character of Roger Patterson, a man with well-documented financial motivations for producing exactly this kind of footage, and a personal history that made some people deeply reluctant to take his word for anything. The second pillar had a name, Bob Heironimus. A Yakima local who knew Patterson personally, Heironimus came forward publicly in 1999, claiming that he was the man inside a homemade Bigfoot suit that day, that Patterson paid him a small sum, dressed him in the costume, and coached him on how to walk. His testimony over the years has been inconsistent in its details, and the Bigfoot research community largely turned against him, while skeptics embraced his account as confirmation of what they had suspected all along. But sitting awkwardly in the middle of both reactions was one uncomfortable fact that neither side could get around. No physical suit was ever produced. For decades, Heironimus' claim existed in a strange limbo, believed by some, dismissed by others, and never definitively proven or disproven, because the one piece of physical evidence that could have settled it had simply vanished. Roger Patterson died of Hodgkin's lymphoma in 1972 at just 38 years old, having maintained to the very end that the creature in his footage was real. According to multiple accounts, days before his death, he told a fellow Bigfoot author that, in retrospect, he wished he had shot the creature and brought back a body instead of a reel of film. That statement has been interpreted two completely opposite ways for decades. To believers, it sounds like the genuine regret of a witness who understood that physical proof would have silenced every critic. To skeptics, it sounds like the private admission of a man who knew, even as he defended the film publicly, that what he actually possessed would never be enough to prove what he claimed happened. Those two readings cannot both be true, and for 55 years there was no way to know which one was. That changed, or at least appeared to change, because of a locked safe. After the death of her father, Norm Johnson, an Olympic College film instructor named Teresa Brooks, found a reel of 16mm film that had been sitting untouched in her father's safe. Johnson had worked in a film laboratory for Boeing during the exact years the Patterson-Gimlin footage was shot, and he had a personal connection to the story through his brother Dave, who knew both Patterson and Gimlin. In June of 2022, Brooks reached out to filmmaker Mark Evans, a colleague, and handed him the reel. Evans digitized the footage and discovered a roughly 40-second clip that appeared to have been produced and developed in 1966, a full year before the famous October 1967 footage was ever shot. What that clip shows is startling in context. A Bigfoot-like figure, noticeably skinnier than the one in the well-known film, walking through a Bluff Creek-style setting with a rougher, less polished version of the same distinctive gait. In other words, if the dating is accurate, what Evans had stumbled onto looked very much like a dress rehearsal for the performance that would later make Roger Patterson famous. Before any of that reached the public, Evans reportedly spent months simply trying to understand what he was looking at. By his own account in later interviews, it took considerable time studying the footage before he became convinced that what he was holding was not just old home movie material connected loosely to the Patterson family, but something that appeared to directly document preparation for the famous 1967 sequence. He has been careful in public interviews not to overstate his own certainty, repeatedly declining to frame the discovery as definitive proof of anything on its own, and instead describing it as new context that changed the direction of the entire project he had originally set out to make. Evans took the discovery to Clint Patterson, Roger's son, now in his 60s and living in Montana. What Clint told him on camera became the emotional core of the resulting documentary, titled Capturing Bigfoot, which premiered at the South by Southwest Festival in March of 2026. Clint was only 12 years old when his father died. He has described his relationship with his father in complicated terms, at once describing him with something close to hero worship while also, in the same breath, calling him a liar. According to Clint, He learned from his mother roughly a decade before this documentary was made that the famous Bigfoot sighting had been staged, a revelation that weighed on him for years. He says he had considered coming forward publicly himself, even contemplating writing a tell-all book, but that his mother, worried about losing the income the film still generated for the family, was deeply upset by the idea, and the relationship between mother and son suffered as a result. Clint also offered an explanation for one of the enduring mysteries of this entire saga. Why, after 57 years of searching by researchers, journalists, and skeptics, no physical suit connected to the film has ever surfaced. According to Clint, he personally watched his father burn the suit piece by piece in a barrel, until nothing of it remained. If true, it means the one piece of tangible evidence that could have ended the debate in either direction was deliberately destroyed by the man who had the most to gain from either outcome, and that a 12-year-old boy stood and watched it happen. The documentary also revisits Bob Heironimus' decades-old claim through a new lens, with Evans and his interview subjects noting how strikingly Heironimus' own natural, uncostumed walk resembles the famous gait seen in the footage, to the point that some observers now argue he barely needed the suit's assistance to produce that movement. That observation raises an uncomfortable question that the documentary does not fully resolve. If Heironimus was coached by Patterson to walk a certain deliberate way, and if that coached walk happened to closely match his own natural gait, does that observation strengthen the case that the whole sequence was staged? Or does it simply describe a coincidence between an actor's real body and the character he was asked to play? Evans does not pretend to answer that question definitively, and to his credit, the documentary is markedly more restrained in its conclusions than the marketing built around it. One of the most striking moments captured on camera did not happen in a studio or an editing room, but at a Bigfoot enthusiast convention in 2024. Clint Patterson and Bob Heironimus, according to accounts of the event, waited in line specifically to speak with Bob Gimlin, now in his 90s, and the last living witness from that October morning in 1967. They approached him with the apparent intention of finally addressing the truth together, on camera, in front of the community that had spent decades defending the footage as genuine. By multiple accounts, Gimlin began to engage with the moment, and then his wife intervened, and the conversation stopped before it could go any further. Gimlin said nothing more. He has maintained his public position that he witnessed something real at Bluff Creek for nearly 6 decades, and as of the documentary's release, he has offered no formal public statement in response to its claims, neither a confirmation nor a denial, just continued silence. For a story that has been defined for 57 years by the absence of a clean, final answer, that unfinished moment at a fan convention, caught on film almost by accident, may be one of the most quietly revealing pieces of the entire saga. The documentary also spends considerable time on figures who existed at the edges of the original story but shaped what it became. Hal Diatley, Patterson's brother-in-law and business partner, is remembered by relatives in notably unflattering terms, with one nephew reportedly summarizing his business philosophy as pure self-interest toward anyone working under him. Diatley had little personal interest in whether Bigfoot was real. What he saw on the footage was money, and by most accounts, he made a great deal of it, using the proceeds to build up his own asphalt business and rise to a prominent position in Yakima society before his death in 2019. His presence in the story is a reminder that whatever else the Patterson-Gimlin film may or may not prove about an unknown primate, it very quickly became a commercial product, marketed, licensed, and fought over by people whose interest in the truth was, at best, secondary to their interest in the profits. Here is where honest analysis requires an uncomfortable pivot, because capturing Bigfoot arrived at South by Southwest with enormous narrative momentum and immediately ran into the limits of what it could actually prove. Every dramatic claim in the film ultimately traces back to a single piece of physical evidence, that one reel of 16mm film pulled from a locked safe. There is no independent witness to its origin beyond the Brooks family's own account, no documented chain of custody before Teresa Brooks handed it over, and critically, the documentary presents no laboratory analysis of the film stock itself, no examination of Kodak edge codes, no emulsion testing, no perforation analysis, none of the forensic steps that would be required to actually date the reel and confirm it was shot in 1966, rather than some other year, by some other person, for some entirely different purpose. Reviewers and researchers who examined the film closely after its premiere were quick to point this out. A Bigfoot research community that conducted its own detailed evidentiary review in the weeks following the premiere gave the documentary a rating of 32 out of 100 for evidentiary value, concluding bluntly that a compelling narrative is not a substitute for scientific verification. As of the documentary's public release, no independent forensic laboratory has been given access to authenticate the reel, no lab reports have been published, and no outside experts have confirmed the 1966 dating through anything beyond the director's own interpretation of what he found. That gap matters enormously, because capturing Bigfoot is not actually a story about forensic science. It is a story about people, told with genuine emotional honesty, and that honesty is precisely what makes it so persuasive, even in the absence of hard proof. Evans spends much of his running time not on the footage itself, but on the human wreckage left behind by it, the friendships destroyed, the family loyalties tested, the small Yakima community whose entire identity became entangled with a 59-second film shot by a man some of them clearly did not fully trust even at the time. Roger Patterson's widow, appearing on camera to discuss the matter publicly for what is reportedly the first time, reportedly described the film's legacy in deeply negative terms, as something closer to a curse on her family than a source of pride. Matt Moneymaker of the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization offered a pointed reaction when informed the documentary intended to present the footage as a hoax, questioning how anyone could accept such a claim in an era saturated with manipulated media, and asking how viewers could be certain that what the documentary shows them from the real is actually representative of everything on it. It is a fair question, and one the film itself never fully answers. According to Evans, the making of the documentary did produce at least one genuinely positive outcome regardless of where the truth ultimately lies. Patricia Patterson, Roger's widow, and Bob Heironimus, childhood friends who had not spoken in more than 30 years because of the fallout from this exact story, were reportedly brought back into contact with each other through the process of making the film. There is also the matter of Greg Long, a researcher and author whose 2004 book on the subject concluded years before this documentary that Patterson was, in his assessment, a con artist, and the film a calculated hoax from the very beginning. Long spent years conducting his own interviews, some of them preserved on cassette tape and now woven directly into capturing Bigfoot as archival material. For a long time, Long was treated by much of the believer community with open hostility, dismissed as an outsider chasing a debunking narrative for its own sake. Watching his older material resurface now, validated to some degree by the documentary's newer claims, adds an uncomfortable layer to the story, because it suggests that a version of this truth may have been available and largely ignored for 2 decades before anyone with a camera crew and a film festival premiere was willing to take it seriously. So where does that leave the actual question at the center of this entire 57-year saga? The honest answer, even after everything capturing Bigfoot claims to reveal, is that it remains frustratingly, almost defiantly unresolved. There is a documentary built around genuinely explosive human testimony, a son's account of watching his father destroy the evidence, a coached walk that mirrors a natural one, and a near confession from the last living witness interrupted before it could finish. And there is, sitting directly underneath all of that emotional weight, a complete absence of the kind of forensic verification that would be required to treat any of it as settled fact rather than a compelling and possibly accurate interpretation of an old reel of film. There is a dead anthropologist who spent 3 decades building the most credentialed scientific case for the footage's authenticity and died still believing it. There's a Hollywood effects specialist who, even after being presented with the documentary's evidence, has reportedly continued to maintain that the original footage shows real, unfakeable biological movement. There is Bob Heironimus, now well into his 80s, who was held to his hoax claim since 1999 without ever once producing the suit that could have proven it beyond doubt. And there is Bob Gimlin, the last man standing from that October morning in 1967, who came close enough to a public confession to have it interrupted mid-sentence, and who has chosen silence ever since. It is also worth pausing on how strange the reception of this documentary has been within the community it was made about. Some of the most dedicated Bigfoot researchers in the country, the same people who have spent literal decades of their lives defending the plausibility of the Patterson-Gimlin footage, greeted capturing Bigfoot not with dismissal, but with genuine, careful engagement, publishing detailed evidentiary breakdowns rather than simply rejecting the film outright. That reaction says something important about where this story sits in 2026 that it did not sit in, say, 1999 when Heironimus first came forward. The community around this footage has matured into something closer to an ongoing investigative body than a fan base, willing to grade a documentary's evidentiary rigor the way a journal might grade a study, even when the underlying conclusion threatens the mythology their entire community was built around. Whatever else can be said about the durability of the Bigfoot myth, that willingness to interrogate a beloved piece of evidence on its own terms is not nothing. What makes the story worth telling in 2026 is not really whether Bigfoot exists. It is what the entire saga reveals about how difficult it remains, even now, to establish a settled version of the truth about a single, heavily scrutinized piece of evidence when the people closest to it have every incentive, financial, emotional, and personal, to shape the story in conflicting directions. The Patterson-Gimlin film was shot by a man with clear motive to fake it, using equipment he had not even properly paid to rent, in a location deliberately chosen because earlier expeditions had already reported unexplained tracks there. It was also defended, right up to his own deathbed, by that same man, with a level of conviction that even his closest family members apparently found difficult to reconcile with the idea that he was simply lying. Both of those facts about Roger Patterson exist at the same time, and logically, they cannot both be entirely true. Yet somehow, the uncertainty between them has proven durable enough to survive 57 years of scientific scrutiny, one deathbed confession, one burned suit, one locked safe, one interrupted convention conversation, and now one feature documentary built around all of it. Capturing Bigfoot does not claim to be the final word, whatever its marketing might suggest, and the filmmakers themselves have been careful in interviews to say the project was never really designed to answer the question of whether Bigfoot is real. Instead, they describe it as an attempt to tell one specific, deeply human story that happened to unfold in the shadow of that question. A story about fathers and sons, about small-town loyalty, about the corrosive effect of unresolved secrets on families who never asked to become part of American folklore in the first place. Whether or not the 1966 reel is ever independently authenticated, whether or not Bob Gimlin ever finishes the sentence his wife interrupted at that convention, the Patterson-Gimlin film itself will almost certainly outlast every documentary, every rebuttal, and every future piece of analysis aimed at it. It was built, whether by accident or design, to sit permanently at the edge of what can be definitively proven, a 59.5-second strip of grainy celluloid that has already outlived nearly everyone directly involved in creating it, and that shows no sign of finally settling the argument it started nearly 6 decades ago. The reel that Teresa Brooks found in her father's safe was supposed to be the thing that finally closed this story. Instead, in true Patterson-Gimlin fashion, it simply opened a new chapter of the same unresolved argument, one more piece of evidence pointing in two directions at once, waiting, as it always has, for someone, someday, to finally walk in with the one piece of proof that 57 years of arguing has never quite managed to produce.